ruthless rancher turned away every mail-order bride until she stepped off the westbound train. The Sinclair ranch sprawled across a desolate expanse of the West, a kingdom built on grit and guarded by bitterness. Inside the main house, a fortress of cold stone and silence. Edward Sinclair presided over his empire of solitude. He needed no one. He trusted no one. Before him lay a stack of letters, each a plea for marriage from a woman he'd never met. He dipped his pen not in black ink, but in red. With a vicious scrawl, he marked another one rejected. To him, they were all the same fortune hunters, grub line riders in silk, seeking to conquer his land through a wedding vow. His rigid control was absolute, a shield. Forged in the fire of a devastating betrayal, he never spoke of a memory that tasted like ash. He believed the walls around his heart were impenetrable. But hundreds of miles away, a woman with nothing to her name but hope clutched a train ticket in her hand. Edward thought he had sealed every entrance to his life, but he was wrong. He forgot about the front door. The Sinclair Ranch was not a home. It was a fortress carved from the heart of the unforgiving West, a sprawling kingdom of dust and cattle, where the silence was broken only by the wind's lonely sermon. And from his throne of dark polished oak, Edward Sinclair ruled it all. The room smelled of old leather whiskey and a bitterness so profound it had become a permanent part of the air. He trusted no one. Before him, on a desk vast enough to map a war, lay the morning's casualties. Letters penned in hopeful looping scripts from women in the East. They spoke of gentle dispositions and God-fearing hearts. They offered their hands in marriage to a man they knew only by the size of his ledger. He saw them not as women, but as invaders, fortune hunters laying siege to his walls. He dipped his quill not in black ink, but in a deep, jarring red, the color of a fresh wound. With a swift, angry scratch, another plea was slain. Rejected. The word was a verdict. A final, satisfying slam of a door that would never be opened. Each rejection was a small victory against a ghost. He could never exorcise the memory of a different woman, of a promise that had shattered and left him with nothing but this cold, hard empire of solitude. He would not be made a fool of again. He reached for the last letter, ready to condemn it to the fire with the others. But his hand paused. The envelope was plain, the paper cheap. The handwriting was not the elegant script of a city lady, but the careful, simple penmanship of someone unaccustomed to writing. It was honest. Against his better judgment, he broke the seal. The words were not of flattery. They were of grit. Mr. Sinclair, my name is Rose Harper. I write to you not as a lady of leisure, but as a woman who has known only work. I have no dowry. I have no family to speak of. I am told you are a man who values strength. I do not ask for your wealth, sir. I ask for a home. I ask for a chance to build a life on land that I will tend to with my own two hands. I am not afraid of the sun or the dirt. I am only afraid of a life with no purpose. Edward read it twice. The words were a stark, clear note in a symphony of cloying perfume and deceit. A fool's hope, a lamb offering itself to a wolf. His first instinct was to burn it to extinguish this ridiculous flicker of sincerity. But a colder, more cynical thought took root. He would summon her. He would bring this hopeful creature to his desolate kingdom and watch as the West broke her just as it had broken him. It would be the final perfect proof that his fortress was necessary, that his bitterness was justified. He would watch her fail. The train station at Harmony Gulch was little more than a sun-bleached platform and a splintered sign. The air shimmered with heat. When the train groaned to a halt, a plume of steam hissing into the oppressive silence, only one person disembarked. From his wagon, Edward watched her. He had expected anyone else. She was smaller than he'd imagined, lost in a simple worn-out dress the color of the dust at her feet. She held a single battered valise. There was no pretense in her, no artifice. But as she scanned the empty platform, her chin lifted. and Edward saw it not fear, but a quiet, unyielding light in her eyes. It was the look of a wild thing that had survived a long winter. He drove the wagon forward, the silence stretching between them. "Miss Harper." His voice was rough, a tool he used to keep the world at a distance. She turned her gaze, meeting his without a flicker of intimidation. "Mr. Sinclair." Her voice was clear, steady. He grunted, gesturing with his head toward the wagon. The journey was difficult. It was a test, not a question. She looked out at the endless baked horizon, a land that swallowed souls whole. "Life is difficult, sir," she replied, her voice even. The journey was just long. He was silent for the rest of the ride, the unexpected answer echoing in his mind. She did not prattle. She did not flatter. She simply existed, a quiet, solid presence that his cynicism could find no purchase on. It was unsettling. As they crested the final hill and his vast, imposing ranch house came into view, he finally spoke again, his tone cold as a winter morning. "You wanted a chance. You have 1 week. 1 week to prove you belong here. If you cannot, the next train out is yours." He expected her to falter, to show the first crack in her resolve. Rose Harper looked at the house, then back at him, the same steady light in her eyes. "I accept your terms, Mr. Sinclair." He turned away, a strange, unwelcome feeling coiling in his gut. The drawbridge to his fortress had been lowered. A stranger was inside. And for the first time in a decade, Edward Sinclair did not feel entirely in control. Edward had expected a frontal assault, a clumsy attempt to prove her strength in the corral, or a brazen effort to charm him with feminine wiles over dinner. He had prepared his defenses for both. She did neither. Rose Harper moved through his cold, sterile ranch, not like a storm, but like the quiet, inexorable creep of moss on stone. She did not challenge his world. She simply began to inhabit the spaces he had long since abandoned. He would catch glimpses of her from his office window, a flash of her worn blue dress in the barren patch of earth behind the cookhouse, where she coaxed stubborn green shoots from soil that had been dead for a decade. He heard her low, humming voice from the stables where she spoke to his skittish mare, a high-strung creature that had bucked every man on the ranch, yet stood for Rose with a soft, trusting eye. His men, a crew of hardened, silent figures, began to change. The grim quiet of the evening mess hall was now punctuated by the occasional murmur of laughter. He once heard his foreman, a man whose face was a roadmap of scars, actually thank her as she handed him a freshly baked loaf of bread. The scent of it, warm, yeasty alive, had drifted into Edward's study, an alien aroma in a world that smelled only of dust and solitude. This was not the swift, clean failure he had anticipated. This was an infiltration, a slow, quiet siege he did not know how to fight. He told himself it was a more cunning form of manipulation, a parlor trick meant to soften him. But the truth, cold and unnerving, was that his fortress was beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. It was an unforgivable weakness. The breaking point came late one night under the sliver of a bone-white moon. Sleep offered him no quarter, his mind haunted by figures he refused to name. He found himself walking the long, dark hallway of the West Wing, a place he kept sealed, a museum of his own failure. He stopped before a single locked door. His hand rose, hovering over the cold brass knob, his shoulders slumping with a weight no one ever saw. "Eleonora," he whispered into the velvet darkness, the name a shard of glass in his throat. A floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around, his grief instantly transmuting into a cold, protective fury. Rose stood at the far end of the hall, a pitcher of water in her hand, her form silhouetted by the faint moonlight from a distant window. She was not spying. Her presence was an accident, a simple coincidence, but the intrusion felt like a violation. She had seen him. She had seen the crack in his armor. "This part of the house is not for you," he said, his voice a low, venomous thing that cut through the silence. Remember your place, Miss Harper." He did not wait for an answer, turning his back on her and stalking away, the shame burning hotter than any anger. The next afternoon, a rider approached. It was Cyrus Creed, his closest neighbor and oldest rival. Creed was a man of polished boots and a predatory smile, his wealth as vast as Edward's, but built on a foundation of ruthless acquisition. Sinclair, Creed drawled, dismounting with an easy grace. His eyes, the color of chips of ice, swept the yard before landing on Rose as she carried a basket of greens from her fledgling garden. His smile widened, but it held no warmth. "Found yourself some new help? She seems a bit fragile for this country. What do you want?" Creed. Edward's tone was flat hostile. "Just a neighborly visit." Creed said, his gaze still lingering on Rose with a possessive gleam. "One must be careful who they let onto their land. Strays often carry diseases." He clapped Edward on the shoulder, a gesture of false friendship that felt like a threat, and after a few more empty pleasantries he rode away. The poison, however, had been sown. Later, Edward watched from his window. He saw two of his ranch hands pause as Rose walked by. He saw them fall silent, their earlier friendliness replaced by a new suspicious scrutiny. He saw them look her up and down, then whisper to each other as she passed. He then looked at Rose. He saw her feel their gazes, a tangible shift in the air. He saw her shoulders tense for a fraction of a second, her step faltering. But then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin almost imperceptibly, and continued walking, her gaze fixed forward. A grim realization settled in Edward's gut. The trial he had set for her was a simple one, but he now saw he had not just brought her into his cold, lonely home. He had brought her into the heart of his war, and Cyrus Creed had just chosen his next battlefield. The poison of Cyrus Creed's words spread faster than a prairie fire. It was a subtle contagion carried on whispers that died whenever Edward entered a room, in sidelong glances that slid away from Rose's gaze in the sudden heavy silence that fell over the bunkhouse when she passed. The easy laughter she had coaxed from his men curdled into a wary suspicion. Edward saw it all. He saw it in the way his foreman now gave her curt-clipped answers, his earlier respect replaced by a guarded distance. He saw it in the eyes of the young stable hand who no longer asked her about her garden. He told himself he was merely an observer watching the inevitable collapse of her charade. But a cold dread was taking root in his own soul. This new reality, this world of whispers and suspicion, was horribly, achingly familiar. He was in his study, the ledger of his vast empire open before him, but the numbers were a meaningless scrawl. The scent of the climbing roses Rose had trained along his window wafted in on the breeze. It was a clean, earthy scent full of life. But his mind, twisted by the past, did not register roses. It smelled only the cloying sweetness of lilacs, the ghost of a perfume that had once promised paradise and delivered only ruin. The ghost had a name: Eleonora. The memory was not a gentle mist. It was a physical assault, a phantom hand clutching his heart. He was young again, his world not this kingdom of dust, but a vibrant tapestry of blind trust and boundless hope. He remembered Eleonora's laughter, a sound like tumbling bells that he had believed was meant only for him. He remembered his best friend Marcus raising a glass to their future, his smile as wide and honest as the sky. The three of them inseparable. A perfect life built on a foundation of lies. The memory shifted, the vibrant colors bleeding into a cold monochrome gray. The day he found the forged deed. The day he discovered that Eleonora and Marcus had not merely been lovers, but partners in a long, calculated conspiracy to bleed his inheritance dry. The final blow had been the letter she left on his pillow, the paper still smelling of her lilac scent. It did not speak of regret. It spoke of pity. It mocked his rancher's simplicity, his foolish open heart that had been so easy to play. You see the world in black and white, my dear Edward. The letter had sneered in his memory. You could never understand the shades of gray where real life is lived. She had not just broken his heart. She had hollowed him out, scooped out his belief in goodness, and left a gaping, echoing void that he had spent the last decade filling with land cattle and a cold, impenetrable rage. And now the ghost was back. He saw Eleonora's calculating smile in Rose's quiet composure. He saw Marcus's false friendship in the way his own men had warmed to her. The bread she baked was not nourishment. It was a ploy. The garden she tended was not for beauty. It was a Trojan horse, a way to make herself indispensable before the inevitable betrayal. The bottle of whiskey on his desk was half empty. The liquor did not dull the pain. It sharpened it into a weapon. He found her in the great hall mending a leather bridle with small, efficient stitches, humming a tune so soft it was barely audible. The domestic tranquility of the scene was an unbearable hypocrisy. It was a lie. It had to be. He stood before her, his shadow falling over her work. She looked up, her humming ceased. She saw the storm in his eyes. "Stop!" He slurred his voice, thick with a pain she could not possibly understand. "Mr. Sinclair." This he said, gesturing vaguely at the bridle at the quiet hall at her. This act, this pretense of the simple, hard-working woman, how long did you think it would last? Her eyes widened a flicker of confusion and hurt. "I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," he snarled, the whiskey lending his voice a raw, ugly edge. He saw Eleonora staring back at him now, her eyes wide with false innocence. "You play your part well, I'll grant you that. Win over the men. Make yourself useful. Bide your time until the master of the house shows a moment of weakness." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But the master has learned his lesson. The vault is closed, Miss Harper." He reached into his coat, his hand closing around a thick wad of cash, the proceeds from a cattle sale that morning. He pulled it out, the bills, a crumpled, ugly symbol of everything he believed she truly wanted. He threw it on the floor between them. The money scattered across the polished wood like dead leaves. "Is this it?" he spat. "Is this the price? Take it, and ride out of here before sunrise. The game is over." He stood back, his chest heaving, waiting. He needed her to break. He needed her to scream, to cry, to lunge for the money and prove that she was the monster his memory insisted she must be. To prove that he was right to be so broken. Rose stared at the money on the floor. A deep, shuddering breath passed through her, the only sign of the wound he had just inflicted. Her gaze lifted from the scattered bills to his face. The hurt was there, deep in her eyes, a raw, visible thing. But beneath it, something else rose. Not anger, not fear, but a vast, profound, and sorrowful dignity. There were no tears. Her voice when she spoke was not a shout. It was quiet, clear, and it cut through his drunken haze like a shard of ice. "How small your world must be, Mr. Sinclair," she said softly, "to have only enough room in it for one woman's ghost." She held his gaze, and for the first time he saw not a schemer, not a reflection of his past, but a person. A person he had just brutalized. "That money is yours," she continued, her voice gaining a strength that pushed him back a step. "And that ghost is yours. I will not be haunted by her, and I will not carry your shame for you." She turned her back straight and walked slowly towards the guest quarters, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous, silent hall. She did not run. She did not look back. Edward stood alone, the scent of whiskey and regret thick in his throat. The money lay at his feet, a vulgar testament to his cruelty. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was not the silence of victory. It was the silence of utter and complete desolation. The morning after his tirade, the ranch was cloaked in a silence more profound than any Edward had ever known. It was the silence of a wound. He awoke in his leather armchair, the empty whiskey bottle standing sentinel on his desk, the air thick with the stale ghosts of his own cruelty. He walked the halls of his house, but it was no longer his. The echo of Rose's final words, "I will not carry your shame for you," had stripped him of his ownership. He was a trespasser in the ruins he had created. His trip to the assay office in Stone Creek was vital in negotiation that would secure his water rights for the next 5 years. But now it also felt like a coward's flight. He needed to escape the suffocating weight of her quiet dignity, the righteous judgment in the eyes of his own men. He gave his orders to his foreman, his voice clipped and hollow. He did not ask for Rose. He did not look for her. A bitter, self-loathing part of him hoped she would be gone when he returned. It would be easier. It would prove he had been right all along. He rode out under a sun that was not a source of life but a merciless white-hot hammer. The land itself seemed to be dying. The grass bleached to the color of bone, the earth cracked and thirsty. It was a reflection of his own soul, and the 2-day ride to Stone Creek was a journey through his own personal hell. He returned as dusk was bleeding across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. A hot, dry wind blew dust into his eyes, and the feeling of dread that had been his constant companion now tightened its grip. He had been gone for 3 days. 3 days for the ranch to fall apart, for his prediction of her weakness to come true. He spurred his horse onward, bracing for the sight of chaos. He found it. But it was not the chaos he expected. As he rode into the main yard, he saw that the water troughs were nearly empty. The cattle were penned close, their movements sluggish, their heads low with a deep, weary thirst. The men were gaunt, their faces etched with exhaustion. But they were not idle. They were not panicked. They were working with a slow, desperate, and organized purpose. He saw a line of them passing buckets hand over hand from the small secondary well near the cookhouse, a well he had dismissed as useless years ago. His foreman, Jed, saw him and approached, wiping a grimy hand across his brow. The man's eyes were bloodshot, but they held a spark of fierce, defiant pride. Mr. Sinclair, Jed, said, his voice a dry rasp. The main dam, it blew out. 2 nights ago. A clean break. Lost almost everything. Edward's blood ran cold. The dam was the lifeblood of his entire operation. Without it, the ranch was a graveyard. How? He managed the word catching in his throat. Jed shook his head, a look of grudging awe on his face. He gestured with his chin toward the house. The girl, he said simply. Miss Rose. He continued his words, painting a picture that Edward's mind struggled to accept. She found us before dawn, standing over the first dead calf. The men were ready to bolt, said the place was cursed. But she was calm, said the land always holds secrets. She took a willow branch and walked the low ground like she was listening to something none of the rest of us could hear. He shook his head again. Damned if she didn't find the old seep. Showed us where to dig. It ain't much, but it's kept half the herd alive. She organized the rationing, figured out how to use strips of canvas to catch the morning dew. Kept the men together. Sir, I ain't never seen anything like it. Edward dismounted, his legs unsteady. He walked through his ranch, a ghost witnessing his own resurrection. He saw her work everywhere. A makeshift shelter for the weakest calves, a careful measured portion of water in every bucket. He saw a world that should have been dead, still breathing through sheer force of will. Her will. He found her at the site of the disaster. The dam was a gaping wound in the earth, a muddy, stinking crater where his prosperity had once been stored. The scale of the destruction was immense. Rose stood at the edge of the breach, looking not at him, but at the broken earthwork. She was covered in dried mud, her dress torn at the hem, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion. She looked like a refugee from the end of the world. When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were not triumphant, nor were they accusatory. They were the eyes of a field general surveying a battlefield. "It wasn't the drought, Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the lonely wind. He followed her gaze. She pointed to the base of the broken wall. The tear in the earth was too clean, too uniform. It was the work of shovels, not water. And then he saw it half buried in the drying mud, glinting in the last rays of the dying sun. A silver flask. He slid down the embankment, his boots sinking into the muck. He knelt and pulled it free. It was heavy, ornate, and engraved with a familiar, mocking elegance. He wiped the mud away with his thumb, revealing the initials. C. Cyrus Creed. The truth slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. While he had been wallowing in his own self-pity, nursing his ancient wounds, this woman, this small, quiet woman he had brutalized with his words, whom he had accused of being a fragile, conniving parasite, had stood alone on his land. She had faced down a disaster. She had stared into the face of his most hated enemy, and she had held the line. He looked from the flask in his hand to her face. He saw the strength there, a power he had never understood, because it was not forged from bitterness or control, but from an unbreakable core of resilience. The great towering fortress of his cynicism, the one he had spent a decade building, did not just crack. It was washed away in a single devastating flood of shame and awe. He opened his mouth to apologize, to thank her, to say something. But no words came. There were no words for the magnitude of his failure or the magnitude of her grace. The walk back from the ruined dam was a silent pilgrimage. Each crunch of Edward's boots on the dry earth felt like the footstep of a condemned man marching to his own gallows. The silver flask heavy in his hand was not just proof of Cyrus Creed's treachery. It was the cold hard evidence of his own monumental, unforgivable blindness. Rose walked beside him, her exhaustion a quiet aura around her, yet her presence was not one of accusation. It was simply a fact as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. He saw the way his men parted for them, their gazes falling on Rose with a deep, weary respect that bordered on reverence. They nodded to him, their employer, but they watched her, their leader. In his own kingdom, he had become a foreigner, while she, the outcast he had nearly broken, had become its heart. The shame was a physical weight pressing the air from his lungs. They entered the vast, quiet kitchen of the main house. It was her domain now, filled with the scent of drying herbs and the lingering warmth of the bread she had baked to keep his men from starving. He saw the tremor of exhaustion that ran through her hand as she reached for a glass of water. For the first time in his adult life, an instinct that was not command but care took over. He moved past her, his motions clumsy, and took the glass from the shelf himself. He filled it from the pitcher and placed it in her hand. He pulled out a heavy oak chair from the table. "Sit, Rose." It was the first time he had used her given name without the cold formality of a title. The word felt strange on his tongue, both an intimacy and an apology. She sat, her small frame seeming to sink into the large chair, her hands wrapped around the cool glass. He sat opposite her, the great table between them a chasm of his own making. He placed Cyrus Creed's flask on the wood. It lay there, a silver snake between them. "This is his—" Edward began, his voice a low, rough thing. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Creed's men did this. They broke the dam." He paused, the confession of another man's sin feeling hollow, meaningless. "But his crime does not wash away my own." The silence stretched thick with unspoken words. He had faced down charging cattle, prairie fires, and armed men without flinching. But this was the most terrifying battle of his life. The battle against his own brokenness. "I have lived a long time in a house full of ghosts," he said, his eyes finally breaking from hers to stare at the flask. "One ghost in particular. I built walls to keep her out, but all I did was trap myself inside with her." He told her then. He spoke of Eleonora not as an excuse, but as a confession of the poison that had rotted him from the inside out. He spoke of the mockery, the theft, the deep defining wound that had taught him to equate love with betrayal and trust with foolishness. "When you arrived," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "I did not see you. I saw her, every kind gesture, every quiet strength. I twisted it in my mind until it looked like a weapon, until it looked like a lie." His gaze finally lifted back to her, and his eyes were raw with the pain he had never allowed another soul to witness. "The things I said to you that night. The money." His voice cracked the memory of his own cruelty, a fresh humiliation. "I needed you to be the monster Rose, because I could not bear to face the one in my own mirror. I tried to break you to prove that I was right to be this way." A single tear, hot and shameful, escaped his control and traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "I was wrong." He let the words hang in the air, a simple, inadequate monument to the vastness of his transgression. He expected her to say something, to rage at him, to leave. He deserved nothing less. Rose was silent for a long time, her gaze never leaving his. He saw the history of his cruelty reflected in her eyes, but he also saw an impossible, unnerving depth of understanding. Slowly she reached across the table. Her small, calloused hand, the hand that had dug for water and saved his world, gently covered his own, which was clenched into a white-knuckled fist. Her touch was not one of pity, but of profound and unconditional grace. The tension in his chest, a knot he had carried for a decade, finally broke. It was in that fragile, sacred moment of quiet connection that the world outside exploded. The thunder of a dozen hoofbeats shattered the evening stillness, a sound of arrogant, violent intrusion. They both shot to their feet, the spell broken. Edward strode to the window, his heart pounding with a new protective fury. In his yard, flanked by 6 of his armed riders, sat Cyrus Creed on his black stallion. He looked at the house, a triumphant, proprietary smirk twisting his lips. He was not here for a neighborly chat. He was a vulture, circling what he believed to be a fresh kill. Creed's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with false sympathy and predatory intent. "Evening, Sinclair. I heard you had some water trouble. Looked like your luck had finally run as dry as your dam." He gestured around at the weakened ranch. "Don't you worry. I'm here to relieve you of this ruinous burden." Edward turned from the window. The ghost of Eleonora was gone, banished by a greater, more present threat. The broken man filled with shame was gone. He looked at Rose, whose hand had moved from his to the back of her chair, her knuckles white but her face calm. In that instant, he was no longer a man hiding from the past. He was the master of the Sinclair ranch, and an enemy was at his gate, threatening not just his land, but the woman who had just taught him what it meant to have a home. He walked towards the door, his spine straight as steel. The final battle had just arrived. Edward stepped out onto the porch, moving from the shadows of his house into the dying blood-red light of the setting sun. He was not alone. He felt Rose come to stand just behind him, a quiet, unshakable presence at his back. Her nearness was not a vulnerability to be protected, but a source of strength he hadn't known he possessed. In the yard, Cyrus Creed sat on his horse, a dark king, surveying a conquered land, his men arrayed behind him like a pack of wolves. "It's over," Sinclair Creed's voice boomed thick with triumph. "Your men have fled, your land is dying. Be smart for once in your life. Sell to me before you have nothing left but dust." A slow, deliberate movement from the corner of Edward's eye. From the long shadows of the bunkhouse, his foreman, Jed, emerged, a rifle held loosely in one hand. Then another man appeared from the stables, and another. They fanned out silent and grim-faced, their loyalty not to the money Edward paid them, but to the home Rose had fought for. Jed gave Edward a short, sharp nod. The battle lines were drawn. Edward felt a calm settle over him, a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The ghosts were silent. There was only the present. There was only the threat. There was only Rose. The only thing dying on this land is your ambition. Creed, Edward's voice was even carrying with an authority that surprised even himself. It was the voice of a man with something to lose, but everything to fight for. He held up the silver flask, its surface catching the last fiery glint of the sun. You left this at the dam. I believe it's yours. A flicker of raw panic crossed Creed's face, visible even from the porch. The arrogant smirk faltered. You're a liar. Am I? Edward countered, his voice like cold steel. Jed, ask the men. Ask them who rallied them when the water was gone. Ask them who fed them when they were ready to flee the curse on this ranch. It wasn't a curse, Creed. It was you. And your greed. Stripped of his lies, publicly exposed, before his own men, Cyrus Creed became something else. The polished veneer of the businessman cracked, revealing the rabid animal beneath. His face contorted in a mask of pure rage, and his eyes, wild and hateful, swung from Edward to the woman standing behind him. He saw her, then truly saw her, not as a fragile piece of property, but as the source of his undoing. You! He shrieked, the sound thin and terrible. A flash of blue steel. He drew his pistol, his arm extending, the black hole of the barrel aimed directly at Rose's heart. The world dissolved for Edward. There was no thought, no calculation of odds. There was only a single, primal, undeniable truth. He threw himself sideways, covering Rose's body with his own, a human shield, against the coming thunder. He braced for the searing impact, for the final sudden darkness, a strange peace settling over him. To die for this, for her, was a better end than to live alone in his cold, empty fortress. A single shot roared through the twilight. But the pain never came. He blinked, the echo of the gunshot still ringing in his ears. He was alive. Rose was alive, her hands clutching his shirt. He looked into the yard. Cyrus Creed was on the ground, howling, his pistol lying in the dust a few feet away. His wrist was a shattered, bloody ruin. On the porch of the bunkhouse, Jed slowly lowered his rifle, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel into the still air. The standoff was over. The aftermath was swift and silent. Creed's men, their leader broken and their crimes exposed, offered no resistance. They were disarmed and sent away, Creed himself slung over a horse to be delivered to the marshal in Stone Creek. As quiet returned to the ranch, Edward turned to Rose. His hands shaking with the last vestiges of adrenaline came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the dust on her cheeks. He looked at her, truly seeing her, the setting sun, catching the impossible strength in her eyes. In that moment, he knew he was looking at his life, his future, his home. They did not speak again until the next morning. A clean, cool dawn was breaking, washing the land in hues of soft pink and gold. The air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. He found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, tending to the green shoots that had been the first sign of life in his barren world. He stood beside her for a long moment, watching her work. "I gave you a week, Rose Harper," he said, his voice soft. "A week to prove you belonged on this ranch." She looked up at him, her hands still in the soil. He knelt before her, taking her dirt-smudged hand in his. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer fought. "This ranch. It only started to belong to me the moment you arrived." "Edward, will you make this your home?" he asked, his heart, the heart he thought long dead, pounding in his chest. With me, Rose's answer wasn't a word. It was the brilliant, tear-filled smile that broke across her face, a smile as bright and full of promise as the rising sun itself. And as he leaned in to kiss her, the first rays of light spilled over the horizon, illuminating the garden, their faces and the vast open fields of their future.